What if you could take a step back and look at the world? Explore the line between certainty and doubt. You are listening to the Illumination Hour with your host, Ellen Stallone. Hello everyone, welcome once again to the Illumination Hour. This is week 9. Wow. So this week our topic is going to verge into the realm of speculation. And we're going to try to uncover some of the cluttered, kind of old, dusty ideas that have been around for a while, but nobody's really examined them until quite recently. So I'm going to start off this journey today by telling you a story. Stop me if you've heard this one before. It might be a little familiar to some of you. 4.6 billion years ago, it was dark. Zoom in onto the Earth, or where it should be anyway, and you'll see nothing but a cloud of gas and rocks smashing into each other, crashing and banging and explosions. Things are flying left and right. You can hardly see, there's so much dust and debris. This is the genesis of our Earth, our home planet, 4.6 billion years ago. So, if we watch this catastrophic, cataclysmic crashing of rocks and dust and dirt for another 0.8 billion years, we see that things start to calm down. Earth is finally a planet. It's a solid mass with an atmosphere. Not like our atmosphere today, of course. It's considerably more toxic than what we would be able to survive. But the Earth also has an ocean that is forming. For the next 1.3 billion years, which is 3.8 to 2.5 billion years ago from now, it's known as the Archean period, but during that time, the first life forms began to appear. That's when that magical moment happened where amino acids that were just floating around in the primordial ooze, somehow they merged together in a specific way. They became a self-replicating organism. Life just spontaneously arose. We don't know how exactly, but we know that it did happen because that is when life began forming and spreading. That's also around the same time that the world's land masses began to form, so it was no longer just rocks and lava and explosions. There were solid islands that were floating around. Initially, the only life forms that could exist on this early Earth were bacteria, which could survive the highly toxic atmosphere that existed during that time. So towards the end of the Archean period, we're moving forward a few million years. At the beginning of the Proto-Terrazoic period, which was 2.5 billion years ago, oxygen-forming photosynthesis began to occur. Now we all know that photosynthesis is the thing. It's the characterizing trait that all plants have that make them plants. So, 2.5 billion years ago, oxygen-forming photosynthesis begins happening, which means the atmosphere begins filling with oxygen. We have found fossils, actually, from life forms of this time. Some might think, oh, that's too long ago, or bacterial fossils? How can that be such a thing? Well, the bacteria formed on rocks, and the rocks if they were preserved in just the right way, we could look at the bacteria or the imprint that they left on these rocks. And we can tell that the first organisms were a type of blue-green algae that could photosynthesize, which is a very smart tactic if you think about it, because what other things were around to be eaten? There were no other living organisms. I mean, you think about what we eat, or what animals eat, or what insects or birds eat. They all eat other living things, whether it be plant or animal. But being the first plants, either you were a cannibal and you ate your own kind, or you produced food from some other source of energy that was around. And for these algae, it was the sun. I like to think about what it was like on that early Earth before anything else existed. Just these bacteria floating around in their happy oceans, devoid of all life, just them, raising their arms to the sun, capturing its warmth and its energy, feeding from it and becoming full from the sunlight. Not a care in the world. Sounds like a beautiful place. So that was going on 2.5 billion years ago, but we jump ahead to 525 million years ago. So now we've moved forward 2 billion years. So this is when the Cambrian period begins. During this time, life exploded. This is when organisms turned from being single-celled to working together in a new sort of way that hadn't been tried before, which was becoming multicellular organisms, clumping together, forming a single unit, each part of the unit having a distinct function. So that was the explosion of life, during which time almost all of the major groups of plants and animals developed in a relatively short time. It ended with the massive extinction of most of the existing species about 500 million years ago, making room for the future appearance and evolution of new plant and animal species. Just to give you some perspective, 498 million years after that, or we're coming up on 2.2 million years ago from now, the first modern human species emerged. So we're just babies in comparison to all of the rest of life. And we certainly would not be around without plants, because the earth was completely barren, inhospitable, and toxic until plants came around to produce oxygen, which is what mostly every living organism breathes or needs in some way. So now that we've formed this timeline of Earth's existence and the things that have grown on Earth, we have some perspective into how young humans are and mammals and other animals compared to plants. Plants have been around since the beginning. They're much older and wiser than us, and sometimes we tend to forget that. Plants have not been viewed very favorably throughout history. Most of the time, they were considered to be just barely living, or not even living beings at all. There are some parts of the world, however, that say that there is a unifying life force that connects all life, plants and animals alike. Although Christianity is not one of those religions. If you think about the story of Noah's Ark, Noah takes all of the life that is important, all of the animals on his ship 2 by 2, but no plants. No one is caring for the plants, and the earth is flooded for 40 days and nights. So what happened to the plants? Well, I guess that's not really important. They're not part of the story because they are not beloved creatures of the world. And they've just been taken for granted in a lot of ways throughout history in stories such as this. Usually the only recognition that plants will get is in agrarian society where people began farming plants. They began growing them and breeding them and finding ways to make them produce more fruit or more vegetables. There are also people such as the Native Americans or the Chinese who were very in touch with plant life and learned how to use them medicinally. And now we are finding with our modern technology that some of these ancient treatments are actually true. For example, aloe. This is a plant that we are all familiar with because we can buy it in most stores in a jelly form. Or maybe you've seen the long, smooth green leaves of these aloe plants. The clear gel within the leaves of this plant is a superior remedy for burns. Use it for thermal burns, sunburns, or any skin irritation. The juice is intended for internal use, and its main use is to help heal ulcers and other intestinal irritations. Be careful though. You only need a teaspoon after meals, otherwise the juice becomes a laxative. But if you take too much, then maybe you have some blackberry root lying around. Blackberry root has been used as an herbal remedy for diarrhea. Users can find tinctures in health food stores. If so, then a teaspoon every 2 to 4 hours may do the trick. Cayenne pepper. It was first introduced to the Old World by Christopher Columbus, and since then, it's become a culinary and medicinal staple. It's been known to relieve toothaches, digestive aid, and a way to alleviate pain as an ointment. That's because of the capsaicin that is inside of the cayenne, which can also be used to relieve arthritic pain. Chamomile, great for relieving heartburn and stomach aches. Cinnamon will warm you up as it promotes your circulation. Comfrey root is great for wounds that never seem to heal, such as bed sores, brown recluse spider bites, and diabetic ulcers. Dandelion tea is used to help relieve kidney and liver disorders. Echinacea is a great antibiotic, antiviral, and immune enhancer. This Native American plant is a fine first-line treatment for colds and flus. Garlic. It's known as an antiviral, antibacterial, antifungal, anti-cancer, and cardiovascular tonic. Ginger. It's great for head colds, congestion, arthritic pain, or if you're looking for something a little more stimulating, ginseng has long been known to be an aphrodisiac. These are just a few of the many, many, many uses that we may have for plants. They're really amazing, versatile creatures, if you think about it. They are living. They are everywhere. They reproduce prolifically. Everywhere on Earth that you look, there's a plant somewhere around. They're little chemical factories. They're all unique in that they make their own signature chemical compounds. It's amazing, don't you think? They just suck things up from the ground, and through their system, they turn it into these compounds that make their leaves green or purple or whatever color they are. They produce flowers that are beautiful and sweetly scented. Or sometimes they just grow and photosynthesize and spread. Another fascinating thing about plants is that some plants in the world are the largest organisms or the oldest organisms. They are so amazing because they range in such variety, single-celled organisms, all the way up to the largest organism in the world, giant sequoia, native to California. These trees can be up to 52,000 cubic feet, 2,000 years old, and almost 2.7 million pounds. Now that's just the largest single tree. If we're talking about largest organism, depending on where you want to go with this, we could say that Pando, which is a clonal colony of quaking aspens, is the largest organism in the world and has been around for 80,000 years. So these quaking aspens, they're actually completely interconnected beneath the ground. It's one giant root system buried beneath the earth, and it sprouts up trees from the root system. So it may look like an entire forest of aspen trees, but really, it's one. And it's 80,000 years old. Now, how amazing is that? There are many other plants that live far longer than we could ever expect. There's a colony of seagrass in the Mediterranean Sea, estimated to be between 12,000 and 200,000 years old. Of course, the maximum age is theoretical. There's also a plant called the Lomatia tasmanica, commonly known as the king's lomatia, which is a Tasmanian shrub. It has shiny green leaves and bears pink flowers, but yields neither fruit nor seeds. Only one colony of king's lomatia is known to be alive in the world. It's also sometimes called the king's holly, but it's not a holly. It's unusual because all of the remaining plants are genetically identical. How it does this is, as a branch falls to the ground, that branch grows new roots. Although the plants are technically separate in that each has its own root system, they're collectively considered to be one of the oldest living plant clones. Each plant's lifespan is approximately 300 years, but the plant has been cloning itself for at least 43,600 years, possibly even up to 135,000 years. There's also a box huckleberry bush in Pennsylvania that is thought to be around 8,000 years old. So these things are all around us, and they're so old. They're ancient compared to us. Some of them don't even seem to have any intention of dying. Perhaps that's something that we all might be interested in learning from plants. So how much do we really know about plants? We know how they work, essentially, on a most basic level, but like I said, it hasn't been until the past few decades that people have begun really looking into how plants work. Most of the time, we walk outside, through the park, out our driveway, wherever it may be, and we see trees and some grass, maybe some hedges and flowers, and we go, oh, that's nice, and then we get in our car and drive away, or we walk off to whatever it is that we're doing. We never slow down and take a look at plants. And to do this, we really need to slow down. One institute that has been studying plants intensely is the Bose Institute in India, which studies the minute movement of plants. Most people would say, but plants don't move. They're stuck in one spot their entire lives. But that is simply not true. Plants do move. They have tiny movements in their roots. They have movements in their leaves. They even have movements in their flowers or in their stems. The reason we don't see this movement is because time seems to run differently for plants than it does for us. Plants function on a much slower level. It could take hours for a plant to move one direction or the other, but that doesn't mean the movement does not happen. It just means that it happens at a rate which we seldom are able to see. One of my favorite plants, both for indoor and outdoor use, just because it's so decorative and you can put it just about anywhere, is the morning glory plant. Now these are vines. As soon as they start growing, they look for something to wrap themselves around and climb up. The tendrils on these plants respond to stimulus or touch. They have very fine hairs that grow on the outside, and when these tendrils are stimulated on one side or the other, they will slow the growth of the cells where it has been stimulated, and the cells on the outside will grow more rapidly, and that is how the tendrils are able to wrap and move around objects in their area. They can change direction as well. Large multicellular plants usually always have a complicated root system. I mean really complicated. They can have millions of root tips. Now these root tips, they can crawl along like a worm. They can spread and search their way into just about any surface. Those plants that are growing through the rocks or through the sidewalk, they're not just weeds. They're organisms that have fought to live there. Their roots have dug and searched blindly, trying to find a foothold anywhere. And they found it. It has also been observed that baby sunflower plants, as they're growing, they will play with each other. Now, this was done in a laboratory setting, so they had direct, steady light from almost every direction. There was nothing that they were competing with that was blocking out their light. They didn't need to search out the light. They didn't need to grow one direction or the other, as plants that grow in the wild often do. No, these sunflowers, they danced around each other. They twirled their heads back and forth, left and right, all around, just to practice for the day when maybe they would need to search out the sun for themselves. You can watch as plants move their leaves back and forth, or as flowers open and bloom. They will always seek out the light. They will move towards it. So plants are not static creatures. They do move and respond. It's just that we're not able to see it happen. So back to the Bose Institute in India. It was actually named after a scientist of the name Bose, who proposed that plants have a similar response to metal from radiation. They have some sort of sensory system. This was a radical idea at the time. Plants were thought to be just barely alive. Most people scoffed at his research. But this was happening at the same time as George Washington Carver was finding hundreds of uses for peanuts, including peanut butter, cement, flour for food, vinegar, flavoring paste, fudge, laundry soap, rubbing oils, and cosmetics. Both these men were not really given the credence that we give them today. They were seen as kind of lunatic revolutionaries of their time. And yet, Bose found something in plants that nobody else had ever found. He hypothesized that maybe plants would respond to electrical activity, or they have electric activity of their own. Jagadish Chandra Bose lived from 1858 to 1937 and was a polymath, physicist, biologist, biophysicist, botanist, and archaeologist, as well as a science fiction writer. He lived in British-controlled India and made a number of pioneering discoveries in plant physiology. He used his own invention, the crescograph, to measure plant responses to various stimuli, and thereby scientifically proved parallelism between animal and plant tissues. Although Bose filed for a patent for one of his inventions because of peer pressure, his reluctance to any form of patenting was well known. To facilitate his research, he constructed automatic recorders capable of registering extremely slight movements. These instruments produced some striking results, such as Bose's demonstration of an apparent power of feeling in plants, exemplified by the quivering of injured plants. His books include Response in the Living and Non-Living and The Nervous Mechanism of Plants. His major contributions in the field of biophysics was the demonstration of the electrical nature of the conduction of various stimuli, such as wounds or chemical agents in plants, which were earlier thought to be of a chemical nature. These claims were later proven experimentally. He was also the first to study the action of microwaves in plant tissue and corresponding changes in the cell membrane potential. He researched the mechanism of the seasonal effect on plants, the effect of chemical inhibitors on plant stimuli, and the effects of temperature. From the analysis of the variation of the cell membrane potential of plants under different circumstances, he hypothesized that plants can feel pain or understand affection. He performed a comparative study of the fatigue response of various metals and organic tissues in plants to compare them. He subjected metal to a combination of mechanical, thermal, chemical, and electrical stimuli, and noted the similarities between metal and cells. Bose's experiments demonstrated a cyclical fatigue response in both stimulated cells and metals, as well as a distinctive cyclical fatigue and recovery response across multiple types of stimuli in both living cells and metals. Bose also documented a characteristic electrical response curve of plant cells to electrical stimulus, as well as the decreased and eventual absence of this response in plants treated with anesthetics or poison. The response was also absent in zinc treated with oxalic acid. He noted a similarity in reduction of elasticity between cooled metal wires and organic cells, as well as an impact on the recovery cycle period of the metal. So there's some interesting correlations there. Another experimenter, Cleve Baxter, who also did studies of his own on plants in the 70s. He studied more into how human emotional change affects plants, but the real scientific basis was in plant electrical potential. He was searching to see what sort of things would make plants nervous or excited, or how they would respond to certain things. So what he did was he hooked them up to a polygraph test. Now, there are claims, which I think are a little out there, that one of the experimenters was going to stimulate one of the leaves with fire and see what happens. And as you know, fire is deadly for plants. But he says that at the time when he thought of the fire, the plant seemed to wake up all of a sudden and start becoming nervous. The polygraph needle jumped up and down. Here's a little bit more about Cleve Baxter, the guy who hooked up plants to polygraphs. He lived from 1924 to 2013 and was an interrogation specialist for the CIA, best known for his experiment with plants using a polygraph instrument in the 60s, which led to his theory of primary perception, where he claimed that plants feel pain and have extrasensory perception, which was widely reported in the media but was rejected by the scientific community because nobody could repeat his results. Which is kind of a big deal if you're a scientist. You want to know that your results are true. He did have some good leads on ideas, though. I mean, plants, after all, interact with the environment around them very much. They're quite social creatures, if you think about it. They grow in forests or even in areas where other plants are. They cannot get up and move and walk around like we do. So they've evolved different techniques for dealing with this. As far as the roots go, the roots spread out. They seek out areas where they can find water and space. Through their roots, they can sense other plants around them. But it gets even more interesting. You could say that the plot thickens as we go deeper into the roots of plants. There's a fascinating article that I came across last year on bbc.com about how plants talk to each other, and it has to do with their roots. This article is kind of what started me on the crusade for knowledge about what plants are, because it just struck me as amazing and so out of the ordinary that I had to look further. This article's called Plants Talk to Each Other Using an Internet of Fungus and is written by Nick Fleming. It's an information superhighway that speeds up interaction between a large, diverse population of individuals. It allows individuals who may be widely separated to communicate and help each other out, but it also allows them to commit new forms of crime. No, we're not talking about the internet. We're talking about fungi. While mushrooms might be the most familiar part of fungus, most of their bodies are made up of a mass of thin threads known as mycelium. We now know that these threads act as a kind of underground internet, linking the roots of different plants. That tree in your garden is probably hooked up to a bush several meters away, thanks to mycelia. The more we learn about these underground networks, the more our ideas about plants have to change. They aren't just sitting there quietly growing. By linking to the fungal network, they can help out their neighbors by sharing nutrients and information, or sabotage unwelcome plants by spreading toxic chemicals through the network. This Wood Wide Web, it turns out, even has its own version of cybercrime. Around 90% of land plants are in mutually beneficial relationships with fungi. The 19th century German biologist Albert Bernhard Frank coined the word mycorrhiza to describe these partnerships in which the fungus colonizes the roots of the plant. In mycorrhizal associations, plants provide fungi with food in the form of carbohydrates. In exchange, the fungi help the plants suck up water and provide nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen via their mycelia. Since the 1960s, it has been clear that mycorrhizae help individual plants to grow. Fungal networks also boost their host plants' immune systems. That's because when a fungus colonizes the roots of a plant, it triggers the production of defense-related chemicals. These make later immune system responses quicker and more efficient, a phenomena called priming. Simply plugging into mycelial networks makes plants more resistant to disease. But that's not all. We now know that mycorrhizae also connect plants that may be widely separated. Fungus expert Paul Stamets called them Earth's natural internet in a 2008 TED Talk. He first had the idea in the 70s when he was studying fungi using an electron microscope. Stamets noticed similarities between mycelia and ARPANET, the U.S. Department of Defense's early version of the Internet. Film fans might be reminded of James Cameron's 2009 blockbuster Avatar. On the forest moon where the movie takes place, all the organisms are connected. They can communicate and collectively manage resources thanks to some kind of electrochemical communication between the roots of trees. Back in the real world, it seems there's some truth to this. It has taken decades to piece together what the fungal internet can do. Back in 1997, Suzanne Simard of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver found one of the first pieces of evidence. She showed that Douglas fir and paper birch trees can transfer carbon between them via mycelia. Others have since shown that plants can exchange nitrogen and phosphorus as well by the same route. Simard now believes that large trees can help out small younger ones using the fungal network. Without this help, she thinks many seedlings wouldn't survive. In the 1997 study, seedlings in the shade, which are likely to be short of food, got more carbon from donor trees. These plants are not really individuals in the sense that Darwin thought they were. Individuals competing for survival of the fittest, says Simard in the 2011 documentary, Do Trees Communicate? In fact, they are interacting with each other, trying to help each other survive. However, it's controversial how useful these nutrient transfers really are. We certainly know it happens, but what is less clear is the extent to which it happens, says Lynn Boddy of Cardiff University in the UK. While that argument rages on, other researchers have found evidence that plants can go one better and communicate through the mycelia. In 2010, Ren Sen Zheng of South China Agricultural University in Guangzhou found that when plants are attached by harmful fungi, they release chemical signals into the mycelia that warn their neighbors. Zheng's team grew pairs of tomato plants in pots. Some of the plants were allowed to form mycorrhizae. Once the fungal networks had formed, the leaves of one plant in each pair were sprayed with a fungus that causes early blight disease. Airtight plastic bags were used to prevent any above-ground chemical signaling between the plants. After 65 hours, Zheng tried to infect the second plant in each pair. He found they were much less likely to get blight and had significantly lower levels of damage when they did if they had mycelia. We suggest that tomato plants can eavesdrop on defense responses and increase their disease resistance against potential pathogen, Zheng and his colleagues said. So not only do the mycorrhizae allow plants to share food, they help them defend themselves. It's not just tomato plants that do this. In 2013, David Johnson of the University of Aberdeen and his colleagues showed that broad beans also use fungal networks to pick up on impending threats, in this case, hungry aphids. Johnson found that broad bean seedlings that were not themselves under attack by aphids but were connected to those that were via fungal mycelia activated their anti-aphid chemical defenses. Those without mycelia did not. Some form of signaling was going on between these plants about the aphids eating them, and those signals were being transported through mycorrhizal mycelial networks, says Johnson. But just like the human internet, the fungal internet has a dark side. Our internet undermines privacy and facilitates serious crime, and frequently allows computer viruses to spread. In the same way, plants' fungal connections mean they are never truly alone, and that malevolent neighbors can harm them. For one thing, some plants steal from each other using the internet. There are plants that don't have chlorophyll, so unlike most plants, they cannot produce their own energy through photosynthesis. Some of these plants, such as the phantom orchid, get the carbon they need from nearby trees via mycelia of fungi that they are both connected to. Other orchids only steal when it suits them. These mixotrophs can carry out photosynthesis, but they also steal carbon from other plants using the fungal network that links them. That might not sound too bad. However, plant cybercrime can be much more sinister than a bit of petty theft. Plants have to compete with their neighbors for resources like water and light. As part of that battle, some release chemicals that harm their rivals. This allelopathy is quite common in trees, including acacias, sugarberries, American sycamores, and several species of eucalyptus. They release substances that either reduce the chances of other plants becoming established nearby or reduce the spread of microbes around their roots. Skeptical scientists doubt that allelopathy helps these unfriendly plants much. Surely, they say, the harmful chemicals would be absorbed by the soil or broken down by microbes before they could travel far. But maybe plants can get around this problem by harnessing underground fungal networks that cover greater distances. In 2011, chemical ecologist Catherine Morris and her colleagues set out to test this theory. Morris, formerly Bartow, grew golden marigolds in containers with mycorrhizal fungus. The pots contained cylinders surrounded by a mesh with holes small enough to keep roots out, but large enough to let in mycelia. Half of these cylinders were regularly turned to stop fungal networks growing in them. The team tested the soil in the cylinders for two compounds made by the marigolds, which can slow the growth of other plants and kill nematode worms. In the cylinders where the fungi were allowed to grow, levels of the two compounds were 179 and 278% higher than in cylinders without fungi. That suggests the mycelia really did transport the toxins. The team then grew lettuce seedlings in the soil from both sets of containers. After 25 days, those grown in the more toxin-rich soil weighed 40% less than those in soil isolated from the mycelia. These experiments show the fungal networks can transport these chemicals in high enough concentrations to affect plant growth, says Morris, who is now based at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. In response, some have argued that the chemicals might not work out as well outside the lab. So Michaela Achatz of Berlin Free University in Germany and her colleagues looked for a similar effect in the wild. One of the best studied examples of allelopathy is the American black walnut tree. It inhibits the growth of many plants, including staples like potatoes and cucumbers, by releasing a chemical called jugalone from its leaves and roots. Achatz and her team placed pots around walnut trees, some of which fungal networks could penetrate. Those pots contained almost 4 times more jugalone than pots that were rotated to keep out fungal connections. The roots of tomato seedlings planted in the juglone-rich soils weighed on average 36% less. Some especially crafty plants might even alter the makeup of nearby fungal communities. Studies have shown that spotted knapweed, slender wild oats, and soft brome can all change the fungal makeup of soils. According to Morris, this might allow them to better target rival species with toxic chemicals by favoring the growth of fungi to which they can both connect. Animals might also exploit the fungal network. Some plants produce compounds to attract friendly bacteria and fungi to their roots, but these signals can be picked up by insects and worms looking for tasty roots to eat. In 2012, Morris suggested that the movement of these signaling chemicals through fungal mycelia may inadvertently advertise the plant's presence to these animals. However, this has not been demonstrated in an experiment. As a result of this growing body of evidence, many biologists have started using the term Wood Wide Web to describe the communication service that fungi provide to plants and other organisms. These fungal networks make communication between plants, including those of different species, faster and more effective, says Morris. We don't think about it because we can usually only see what is above ground. But most of the plants you can see are connected below the ground, not directly through their roots, but via their mycelial connections. The fungal internet exemplifies one of the greatest lessons of ecology. Seemingly separate organisms are often connected, and many depend on each other. Ecologists have known for some time that organisms are more interconnected and interdependent, says Boddy. The Wood Wide Web seems to be a crucial part of how these connections form. Wonderful article. But it's not just that. Above the ground, as plants are growing, they move their stems or their trunks one way or another to capture as much sunlight as possible. Through their leaves, we have found that they sense and they spread chemical messages. One of the best examples of this comes from Africa. There is a story told by Wouter van Hoven, who was in Africa studying an animal called the kudu. Now, there are preserve lands in Africa where animals just roam free, and these kudus are kind of like deer with large horns that spiral up. Anyway, during this period of time, there was a massive drought. Plants were dying left and right. There was hardly any food left for these poor animals. So they turned to the acacia tree, a hardy, shrub-like tree that grows needle-like leaves and has sharp thorns all the way up the stems to keep away predators. So the kudus were eating these acacia trees to avoid starvation, but they began dying mysteriously. There was no explanation for this. Van Hoven began studying what was happening to the kudus and found that their mortality was density related, as in, if there were more kudus in one geographic location, there would be more dead ones. But why? That didn't explain anything. So he began an investigation. He studied the kudus, where they were going, what they were eating, and he found every kudu that died had one thing in common. So, to test his theory, he performed several autopsies on these dead kudu. He cut open their stomach, their intestine, and found that their intestines had a lower rate of fermentation of their food, caused by high tannin levels. Now, tannin is a chemical that the plants use for defense. He also found that there was higher tannin levels in the branches with more activity. The branches that had been eaten more were producing more of this tannin as a way to poison the kudus. He began taking air and gas samples from around the branches of these trees, because he found that even trees that had not been eaten also had high tannin levels. Now, how do you explain that new mystery? Well, the samples of the gas and air around the trees that he took had high levels of ethylene. The only way to explain this is that trees and plants communicate with each other, chemically speaking. Once a tree is attacked by a kudu, It releases high levels of ethylene as a sort of warning to the other plants around it. Hey, the kudus are coming. Get ready. Produce more tannin. The ethylene is a warning, and as the trees absorb it, it affects their mitochondria, which makes them create more tannin. Now, this is an ingenious survival strategy that plants have that many animals don't. Now, this may be a little shocking and surprising, but plants actually interact with other plants and with animals on a much larger scale than just locally. Plants rely on animals in a very important way. So when it comes to reproduction, some plants are self-pollinating. They can just do it themselves. They clone themselves, essentially, and their babies are a copy of themselves. Other plants, however, that have developed a more complex strategy, they rely on pollinators like bees or other crawling insects. For example, orchids grow flowers that look like female bees. This attracts the male bees, and they come and land and mate with the flower, not realizing that it's just a flower. And then they fly off and they do it again with another flower. Orchids are actually kind of tricky when it comes to this symbiotic relationship that most plants have with their pollinators. Many flowers will hold inside of them a sweet, high-energy nectar that insects can feed off of. So the plant gets the pollination, and in return it gives the nectar. Whereas this orchid flower that looks like the female bee, it gives nothing in return. So they can be quite cunning when they want to be, but they have evolved to be this way because they've been around far longer than any other life form has. Plants don't share our evolutionary origins. Humans have somewhere around 20,000 genes. Looking at something like rice, the plant rice has somewhere around 50,000 genes. Now we know that the number of genes is not linked to intelligence, and it's a little risky to say that because we don't really know how to define intelligence exactly. But the higher number of genes may mean that plants are more evolved than us, which would make sense. Plants have been around for a long time. They've learned to adapt and cooperate with each other. And maybe they do have some level of intelligence. I mean, after all, they interact with their environment in ways that we cannot. When oak trees sense other plants within their territory, their roots release a toxin that kills other plants around them. The Desmodian dancing plant responds to sound in a way that no other plant does. Whenever it hears music, it begins to dance, and you can actually train it to move to the music that you want it to dance to as well. It's just like a young person. When they first start, they aren't very good at dancing, and the more they do it, the more they practice, the better they become. This isn't to say that music affects plants, however. There has been research into whether or not music helps plants to grow better. There was actually a composer that created something called green music, in which he took the electrical responses from plants as they interacted with the people viewing the plants, as the people touched them or passed by and the plants got a whiff of them, or maybe just the sounds. So he took those electrical impulses from the plants and turned it into music. He turned it into something he called green music. This is not the only time it's been done. There was a scientist named Hashimoto who researched for Fuji Electronic Company. He, along with his wife, turned electrical outputs of plants into modulated sounds. Now with this, Hashimoto's wife tried to train the plants to understand their language. And although this may seem kind of like a titillating concept, it hasn't quite been proven yet that we can communicate with plants on that level. We can see and understand many other things about plants. Research in the Soviet Union back in the 70s actually showed that plants can display annoyance when tobacco smoke is blown on their leaves, or when other plants are being mutilated. They send out a sort of chemical scream for help. Their electrical impulses go crazy. On a positive note, though, this technology can be used for something beneficial. such as greenhouses. If you attach plants to wires and you carefully study their outputs, you can tell whether they are thirsty and need water, or they're too hot or too cold, or they're burnt and need shade or different nutrients. It can be quite helpful, and it can also be used to grow a huge crop of plants. There are many other questions that we have about these life forms, such as, do plants sleep? Do they have an internal biological clock, like humans or other animals do? There was a study done on the Albizia, which is in the leguminous family, because this plant folds its leaves at night, which makes it very obvious if it's falling asleep or awake. The researchers tried to do a sleep deprivation study on this plant and found that after 2 weeks without sleep, the plants turn yellow and die. Now, they're not really sure why this happens. Is it something to do with the actual energy that the plant has? Is there some sort of malfunction within the energy production? We have no clue why it happens, but we do know that plants do go to sleep at night. They actually chemically prepare for it. They know when the sun sets and also when the sun is going to rise, depending on what time of year it is. They found that the plant secretion that causes sleep is potassium chelidone. And how they found this is they took plant secretions, purified it in a centrifuge multiple times, and then ended with a pure substance, which when they put it on the plant, made it go to sleep. Another fascinating thing about them is that they have a memory of direction in space. They can sense when they're being touched by insects or overgrazed. Their memory capacity is, of course, different for them as it is for us. So we need to completely rethink the way that we study them. If you take a plant and grow it sideways, put it in a refrigerator, and then take it out hours later, it will still remember that it was sideways. There are things called statolites in the roots of plants, which are made of heavier particles that condense right at the root tips. These particles, depending on which way they fall, show direction for the plant, so on a molecular level, they understand where they are. There are many other fascinating things about this zone right behind the root tip, which is where the most activity and growth happens for the root. It has a completely different physiology than the rest of the plant, something that we may even call their central nervous system. Now, the reason we say that is because there are neuron-type cells in this area of the root. It initiates chemical, physical, and electrical changes. Now, if you cut off the root cap, the root will no longer inch around and squirm and search for weak spots. It will just grow straight and have less of a chance of surviving. So this special area behind the root tip is also known as the zone of transition. There are high concentrations of chemicals there called lactin and cyosine, which are the same chemicals found in animal muscle cells, which help us to move and also function as synapses between our muscles and our brain. This is how roots feed and explore space, with this brain of theirs. So this begs the question, is there a field of study such as plant neurobiology? They have no nervous system or brain, but on a structural molecular level, they have things that are similar mechanically to our brain. Of course, the mechanics are slightly different, but the results are similar. What exactly does that mean for our view of plants? One thing we can say for sure is that they are quite strange and different compared to us. They have their brains in the ground and their sexual organs presented above ground to the rest of the world. Picture, if you can, a person with their head buried in the ground and their legs sticking up in the air in all strange sorts of fashions. That is essentially what plants are. So the whole reason I bring this up is because I have a deeply rooted respect for plants. Not only are they the base of the food chain, they produce our oxygen, the air we breathe, they cleanse the air of toxins, and they also provide food, not just for us, but for every living thing on the planet. They are the base of the food chain. Without them, we wouldn't exist. We would die very quickly if all of the plants in the world were wiped out, and we never would have formed without them. They have ways of solving problems that we as living beings who are preoccupied with the other things that are happening all around us that are just distractions, we would never think to be so creative as plants. And this is actually consistent with the theory of evolution. Plants have been around much longer than us. They're more evolved and perhaps intelligent in a certain sense of the word than we are. And if you don't believe me, well, just think, what if there was some sort of global disaster? Who do you think would survive longer or spread farther? Humans or plants? Now, the answer to that question might be a little shocking. I think once we come to terms with that, we can realize that we need to cooperate with plants and learn how to work with them and understand them better in order for us to improve not only the quality of our food or our lawn, but also our survival as a species. We all depend on plants, and they depend on the other living, moving beings around them. They may just seem like weeds to you. They are far more evolved and important than that. I hope that I've given you a new respect for what plants are and taught you more than just your basic biology course would have. Thanks for listening, everybody. This has been the Illumination Hour with me, your host, Ellen Stallone. See you next week.